Welcome everyone to our third drop-in session of the summer. As I've described in previous sessions, these sessions are a great invitation. They are an invitation to take a deep breath, to lay aside everything else. It is an invitation to let our hearts slow down, to let God take care of the world, including our personal worlds. It is an invitation to come away with Jesus. He says in Mark 6, verse 31, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." In that original context, he is speaking with his disciples, his followers, and we are his disciples too. In Matthew 11, verses 28 to 30, he says, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Now, in the last session, just to kind of orient us for this one, we focused on the reality that we keep running up against when hurry becomes a way of life for us. We looked at how we are not created to function in a perpetual state of hurry, constant stimulation, busyness, distraction, and so on. And when we try to do that, it damages us and steals what we truly need and what is truly life-giving from us. Hurry, the overbusyness of life, and anxiety, it's not good for us. It does not make for a good way of life. If you want more information on that, check out session 2. But in today's session, we get to switch gears to examining the solution to our hurry-induced problems, the way of life that Jesus Christ invites us to. It is a way of life that is characterized by rhythms of rest and activity, of solitude and fellowship, of silence and conversation, of Sabbath and work, and so on. So John Mark Comer, in his book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, which I'm going to quote to you at length once again, he writes that in Genesis, the opening book in our library of scripture, our defining narrative says that we're made in the image of God, but also we're made from dust. This means we are both image and dust. To be made in the image of God means that we are rife with potential. We are like God. We were created in his image, his behavior to rule like he does, to gather up the raw materials of our planet and reshape them into a world for human beings to flourish and thrive. But that's only half the story. We're also made from the dirt. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. We're the original biodegradable containers, which means we're born with limitations. We're not God. We're mortal, not immortal. Finite, not infinite. One of the key tasks, hold on. That's the wrong quote on your page. I'm so sorry, but I'm going to read you the right one. One of the key tasks of our apprenticeship to Jesus is living into both our potential and our limitations. What happens, though, when maximizing our potential is our only focus inside and outside the church? Usually we end up with profoundly heavy burdens or burnout. We end up exhausted. There's a lot of misery, which again we examined last time. Essentially, it is death to our souls and even to our bodies. We cannot live like we have no limits without slamming into those limits at some point. We run into reality. And what's worse, if this is the only part of the story that we're told and that we cling to, then we feel like hitting those limits means we did something wrong. We didn't have enough faith. We didn't pray enough, try hard enough. We weren't disciplined enough. We should be able to handle everything, keep up, do everything, take care of everyone, love all the people, like all the people, be around all the people all the time. And we start doing silly things like sacrificing all of our needs and wants to put others first all the time, deciding we'll sleep when we're dead in order to be a good Christian now. And then we wonder why we feel utterly worn to unraveling when we're trying so hard to follow Jesus and do everything right. What's wrong with me? Now, if in the church, and I'm talking about the larger Western church here, we are being encouraged or even rewarded for constantly pushing past our limits and overcoming everything about human existence, and the culture does the same, it's very easy to find ourselves at one time or another in an overwhelmed and non-functioning place. And it isn't because something is wrong with us or our design, but rather our way of living. Our limits are not being acknowledged and needs are not being met. To be human is to have limitations. It is literally by design. We are limited by our physical bodies, our minds, and their limited capacity to know, understand, and remember, our giftings, our personalities and emotional wiring, our families of origin, our socioeconomic origins, our education and careers. We're limited by our seasons of life and their responsibilities, our lifespan of 80 years, give or take. And we're limited by God's call on our lives. God sets limits on what He will enable us to do. He created us to be inherently limited. And for us to constantly push against those God-given limitations, refusing to accept them, is a form of rebellion against God. It isn't good for us. It will, in fact, harm us and harm our relationship with God. John Mark writes, "What if these limitations aren't something to fight, but to gratefully accept as a signpost to God's call on our souls?" God does everything on purpose. Now, there are things in our lives that we are called to overcome in Christ. But that doesn't mean we're supposed to overcome being human, as though these limitations are bad, as though being a limited human being who has to stop, rest, sleep, eat, not be around people sometimes, or be around people more is a bad thing. The God-given limitations are deliberately created into us. Jesus himself took on humanity, limitations and all, in the incarnation. Jesus overcame sin and evil. He did not overcome the human need to eat, sleep, have time alone, have a close community, spend time with the Father, resting from work. He did overcome some of those after his death and resurrection, but we're not there yet. When he was living, leading up to the cross, he slept and he ate and he took breaks from ministry and he spent time with his friends. And not just his disciples. It wasn't just like your ministry group. John Mark writes that how we spend our lives, how we spend our time is how we spend our lives. It's who we become or don't become. In Ephesians 5, it says, "Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time, because the days are evil." Now, that phrase, making the best use of the time, can be translated redeeming the time, making the most of every opportunity, and making the most of every chance you get. However, this does not mean that we need to do absolutely everything in order to be making the most of every opportunity and redeem the time. That is worldly wisdom, to try to pack everything in, to cover all of your bases. Jesus himself said no to certain things, activities, and people, and he did it all the time. Or he would say to them, "Not now. Wait. The time isn't right." We have God-given limits, and as we will see, God-given rhythms of living that are not about packing out our every single waking moment with activity and avoiding sleep and rest and anything that's not wildly productive, because that wouldn't be making the most of every opportunity. One of my favorite examples of this comes from the life of Elijah. When Elijah, who was a prophet of the Lord, when he successfully challenged the priests of Baal to essentially demonstrate whether Baal or the Lord was the true God, he ended up being hunted down by an extraordinarily evil queen. He experiences this fantastic victory, and then he's right back into the thick of it. For him, personally, things do not get better. They get more dangerous. Now, at this point, Elijah had been calling people back to following God for years. It had cost him a great deal, and many before him had done the same. He was entirely exhausted, discouraged, and broken and depressed, to the point that he keeps telling God that he's had enough and to please just take his life. And God doesn't berate Elijah. He doesn't scold him. He doesn't tell him to pull it together, try a little harder, that he should just be able to handle it, to just have more faith, that he will have to sleep later because there's too much important work to be done now, that people need him. Nothing like that. In fact, Elijah falls asleep under a bush, and twice an angel wakes him to give him food and water until he is strengthened for the journey. And then Elijah takes a 40-day and night road trip to Horeb, the mountain of God. He has a sleepover on God's mountain in a cave, and he ends up meeting with God. He hears God's voice. He works through the heaviness in his heart with his God. And God gives Elijah a deeper revelation of himself. And then God sends him on to the next season of his ministry. And Elijah is able to continue well with his hope restored. I really love, though, how Joy Clarkson puts it. She writes, "This is your gentle reminder that one time in the Bible, Elijah was like, 'God, I'm so mad. I want to die.' So God said, 'Here's some food. Why don't you have a nap?' So Elijah slept, ate, and decided things weren't so bad. Never underestimate the spiritual power of a nap and a snack." And there is a lot of truth in this. But the reason I point out this story now is to remind us that God knows what he is doing. He is perfectly wise. He is never knocked around by the tyranny of the urgent, the things that seem like they must be done right now. God is never in a hurry. This means it is safe to trust him when he says we need to slow down, to stop, sleep, eat, and drink, or to prepare for a journey, to take time, even extended time, away from the very important work in order to meet with God and work through the heaviness in our hearts and know God better. Now, this is something that we are going to talk about in more detail in the upcoming sessions, and specifically what this looks like. If you're feeling some kind of internal pushback where it still seems like, oh no, this is still going to be so much work and I can't possibly say no to all of these things, please take a breath. I know that feeling very, very well. And I am not asking you to abandon people who depend on you or to ignore all of your responsibilities. We are going to talk in much more detail about how we do this in healthy ways, how it's actually manageable and the burdens get lighter. We just can't go into that detail today because I already had to cut like 3,000 words from this talk. And so I'm trying really hard not to rabbit trail too much. So back on script. When Jesus was on earth during the incarnation, he was known for most of his ministry as a rabbi. His own disciples most often addressed him as rabbi. In Hebrew, this means teacher. A massive portion of his ministry was spent teaching as a rabbi, and not just his own disciples, but he wandered the country and taught tons of people. Now, as a rabbi, Jesus had two things. First, John Mark points out, he had a yoke. A yoke was a common idiom in the first century for a rabbi's way of reading the Torah. It was his set of teachings on how to be a human. The Torah, if you're not familiar with that term, is the book of the law. It is largely what we would call the Old Testament, but specifically the first 5 books that have all the law in them. So his yoke was his way to shoulder the at times crippling weight of life. It included marriage, divorce, prayer, money, sex, conflict resolution, government, all of it. A yoke is how you shoulder a load. And what made Jesus unique wasn't that he had a yoke. All the rabbis had a yoke. It was that he had an easy yoke. So this is just to give you a bit of a visual of what we're talking about in our metaphor. Because not all of us come from farms, and even those of us who do, we don't really have yokes like this happening anymore. But this is a tool for oxen so that they can do the work that is assigned to them, that needs to happen on a farm. And so they can do it without hurting themselves. Let us continue. So secondly, Jesus had apprentices. In Hebrew, that word is talmidim, which is usually translated as disciples, but it's probably better translated as apprentices, given how we understand the word apprentice. To be one of Jesus' talmidim is to apprentice under Jesus, to organize your life around 3 basic goals. Be with Jesus, become like Jesus, do what he would do if he were you. Now, the whole point of apprenticeship is to model all of your life after Jesus. And in doing so, to recover your soul, to have the warped part of you put back into shape, to experience healing in the deepest parts of your being, to experience what Jesus called life to the full, what the New Testament writers call salvation. Now, the Greek word soteria that is translated as salvation in our Bibles is also translated as healing. When we read that someone is healed or saved by Jesus, it's the same word. And so John Mark writes that this is what Jesus was all about. Healing people, saving them at a soul deep level. How? Through apprenticeship to him. So everywhere Jesus went, he was constantly offering an invitation. Sometimes it was short and sweet, like in Matthew 4:19, where he simply says, "Come, follow me." And then in this one, you're probably very familiar with by this point, if you've been following the drop-in session so far. In Matthew 6:10, I can't remember, it says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." It is Matthew 11. I can remember the 28 to 30 part, but I cannot get that chapter to stick. By the end of the summer, I'll have it. Now, the Message paraphrase by Eugene Peterson goes like this: "Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly." The unforced rhythms of grace, the easy yoke, the way of life according to Jesus. This is what we're putting our faith in. We are trusting that we can take God at his word, that he means what he says and he knows what he's talking about. And so it is safe to obey him and do what he's calling us to do. Now, Dallas Willard writes, "In this truth lies the secret of the easy yoke. The secret involves living as Jesus lived in the entirety of his life, adopting his overall lifestyle. Our mistake is to think that following Jesus consists in loving our enemies, going the second mile, turning the other cheek, suffering patiently and hopefully, while living the rest of our lives just as everyone else around us does. And it's a strategy bound to fail." We cannot just do church on Sunday and then have quote unquote normal life Monday to Saturday and expect it to work. And I'm not talking about one necessarily like sinning really hard 6 days a week. It might simply look like the average North American Western lifestyle. And then when the chips are down, we just try really, really hard to be a good Christian. And we wonder why we keep face planting. And then we try harder and we fail harder and everything is hard. Nothing feels easy or light, let alone joyful or peaceful or life-giving. So John Mark writes, "If you want to experience the life of Jesus, you have to adopt the lifestyle of Jesus." Now, this presents us with two problems. First, we might not know how to adopt the lifestyle of Jesus. He was a first-century Jewish man who essentially roamed the country, teaching in synagogues, on mountains, sometimes in a boat, with 12 of his closest friends, sometimes performing miracles, having picnics. There was wine. Whereas I am a 33-year-old piano teacher who doesn't think she could ever handle being around 12 people like all the time in any century. What am I supposed to do with Jesus' lifestyle exactly? It doesn't practically compute one-to-one. Now, the other issue is wonderfully illustrated by my darling piano students and these chickens. We don't want to practice. We want to skip ahead to the part where we're already awesome, where we already know what we're doing. But that is not even remotely realistic. And this is the reality that we keep running up against. John Mark writes, We read the stories of Jesus, his joy, his resolute peace through uncertainty, his unanxious presence, his relaxed manner, and how in the moment he was, and think, I want that life. We hear his open invite to life to the full and think, sign me up. We hear about his easy yoke and soul deep rest and think, gosh, yes, heck yes, I need that. But then we're not willing to adopt his lifestyle. Back to Dallas Willard for a minute. He writes, we are saved by grace, of course, and by it alone, and not because we deserve it. That is the basis of God's acceptance of us. But grace does not mean that sufficient strength and insight will be automatically infused into our being in the moment of need. Abundant evidence for this claim is available precisely in the experience of any Christian. We only have to look at the facts. A baseball player who expects to excel in the game without adequate exercise of his body is no more ridiculous than the Christian who hopes to be able to act in the manner of Christ when put to the test without the appropriate exercise in godly living. Following in his steps cannot be equated with behaving as he did when he was on the spot. To live as Christ lived is to live as he did all his life. This means when we are called to follow him, there is no shortcut. It's not just follow Jesus when life is really hard, just the times when it counts extra. Follow him all the time. This means we not only follow him in our activity, in what we might classify as the really Christian parts of our life, or in the ministry parts of our life. It means also following him in our rest, following him in our relationships, following him in our yeses and our nos. There is no shortcut. It takes practice. It takes sacrifice. There is a cost. But it is wonderfully worthwhile. John Mark writes, in fact, you get back far more than you give up. There's a cross, yes, a death, but it's followed by an empty tomb, a new portal to life. Because in the way of Jesus, death is always followed by resurrection. Whereas following the ways of the world, death is just death. It cannot lead anywhere else. John Mark continues by saying, your life is the byproduct of your lifestyle. By life, I mean your experience of the human condition. And by lifestyle, I mean the rhythms and routines that make up your day-to-day existence, the way you organize your time, spend your money. There's a saying in business literature that I love. Every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. If the results you are getting are lousy, anxiety at a simmer, mild depression, high levels of stress, chronic emotional burnout, little to no sense of the presence of God, and inability to focus your mind on the things that make for life, etc., then the odds are very good that something about the system that is your life is off kilter. The way you've organized your morning or evening routine, your schedule, your budget, your relationship to your phone, how you manage your resources of time, money, and attention, something is out of whack. And this is where simply trying hard to be like Jesus simply won't work. The system is flawed, and unless we address what is out of whack, we will simply keep getting the same result. And Jesus doesn't tell us to try hard. He says, take my yoke upon you. Do it differently. Here is a system and a whole set of tools that we're going to study together that are going to help you get the life that you want, that you need. Frederick Dale Brunner, who is a scholar specializing in the book of Matthew, he writes, a yoke is a work instrument. Thus, when Jesus offers a yoke, he offers what we might think tired workers need least. They need a mattress or a vacation, not a yoke. But Jesus realizes that the most restful gift he can give the tired is a new way to carry life, a fresh way to bear responsibilities. Realism sees that life is a succession of burdens. We cannot get away from them. Thus, instead of offering escape, Jesus offers equipment. Jesus means that obedience to his Sermon on the Mount, his yoke, will develop in us a balance and a way of carrying life that will give more rest than the way we have been living. John Mark writes, there is an emotional and even spiritual weight to life. We all feel it, especially as we age. Life is hard. Jesus offers his apprentices a whole new way to bear the weight of our humanity with ease. At his side, like two oxen in a field, tied shoulder to shoulder, with Jesus doing all the heavy lifting. At his pace, slow, unhurried, present to the moment, full of love and joy and peace. An easy life isn't an option. An easy yoke is. Now, if we look at the life of Jesus, you will notice Jesus was never in a hurry, like to a weird extent. In John 11, there's an account where Jesus' close friend Lazarus gets very sick. And when Jesus hears about this, it says he stayed where he was 2 more days. In Matthew 5, Jesus takes his time with a woman dealing with a chronic health condition of 12 years. But he doesn't do this like on a day off. He was in the middle of teaching, had already been interrupted by a man named Jairus, who fell at his feet and begged him to come heal his little girl who was on the verge of dying. And while he's on the way to Jairus's home, this woman, essentially interrupts Jesus. She doesn't mean to, but she does. And Jesus takes his time to identify her, to speak with her. He calls her daughter, and he does not rush, even though the circumstances would make most of us at least power walk. There's an account where Jesus is teaching in an absolutely packed house, and a group of men, they literally dig a hole in the roof and lower their paralyzed friend down in front of Jesus so he will heal their friend. Just imagine that. Imagine the church packed out on Easter Sunday. Pastor Sean is preaching, and we hear something strange, just kind of between the natural pauses, because Pastor Sean actually does pause, unlike me. He might look up at some point and realize, or we all notice, because it's a big stage, there's someone being lowered down, just little by little, in the middle of the sermon, until this person is laying right in front of the pulpit. And so Jesus doesn't get upset. He doesn't seem confused or put off at all. Rather, he is pleased with their faith, and he fully stops the sermon to heal their friend. John Mark writes, I am struck by how fiercely present Jesus was, how he just would not let anything or anyone, even a medical emergency or a hurting father, rush him into the next moment. Jesus' schedule was full. It was full to the brim at times in a good way, yet he never came off hurried. This rootedness in the moment and connectedness to God, to other people, and himself weren't the byproducts of a laid-back personality or a pre-Wi-Fi world. They were the outgrowths of a way of life. A whole new way to be human that Jesus put on display in story after story. After all, this is the man who waited 3 decades to preach his first sermon, and after 1 day on the job as Messiah, he went off to the wilderness for 40 days to pray. Nothing could hurry this man. If someone did those things in our day and culture, even in ministry, we might call it misplaced priorities or insensitivity, especially if a father is waiting there, waiting for you to come and minister to his dying daughter, or poor time management. See, we know better when we read these stories about Jesus, these accounts. We know that Jesus knew what he was doing. So it's so interesting that we apply an entirely different metric to ourselves because we're called to live like him. So again, if we look at the life of Jesus and the rhythms of his life, we notice some really important things. His life had margin. It had space between his load and his limit. He would regularly get up early and go off to a quiet place to be with his Father, sometimes even overnight or for a few weeks at a time, away from the crowds to gather himself to God. John Mark writes, more than once we read stories about Jesus sleeping in and the disciples having to wake him up. I like this Jesus and I want to follow him. He frequently had long meals with his friends, with wine, creating space for in-depth conversations. He practiced Sabbath on a weekly basis, an entire day set aside for rest and worship. He practiced simplicity, living freely and lightly, possessing only what he needed. By saying yes to the Father and his kingdom, Jesus constantly said no to countless other invitations. We even see this when Jesus is tempted in the wilderness, and Satan is trying to convince Jesus to live for money, for power, and for comfort. And Jesus instead chooses God's way and word over and over and over. And then Jesus calls us to follow him, to take up his rule of life. John Mark writes that a rule was a schedule and set of practices to order your life around in a monastic order, the way of Jesus in community. It was a way to keep from getting sucked into the hurry, busyness, noise, and distraction of regular life. It was a way to slow down, a way to live into what really matters, what Jesus called abiding. It included key relationships with family and community, the work God has set before us, a healthy soul. Now that word rule comes from the Latin word regula, which literally means a straight piece of wood. And this is where we get our word ruler. But it was also used for a trellis. So if you think of Jesus' teaching on abiding in the vine from John 15, which is one of his most important teachings on emotional health and spiritual life. What is underneath every thriving vine? A trellis. a structure to hold up the vine so that it can grow and bear fruit. Now, if a vine doesn't have a trellis, it will die. If your life with Jesus doesn't have some kind of structure to facilitate health and growth, it will wither away. Following Jesus has to make it onto your schedule and into your practices, or it will simply never happen. Apprenticeship to Jesus will remain an idea, not a reality in your life. But here's the rub. Most of us are too busy to follow Jesus. So as you listen to this, I imagine if you're like me, there are reasons why not to do this that keep popping up in your mind. Maybe they come with a spark of anxiety or a kind of pushback. This isn't going to work because, or yeah, but except fill in the blank. You might be thinking, I just don't have time. I can't fit one more thing in right now. I have so much work. I have kids. I have so many people who need me. I'm training for a marathon. I'm not an introvert like you, or I'm not single like you, or I'm not childless like you. You have so much freedom at this stage in your life. I don't have the mind for it. I can't possibly say no to fill in the blank. Now, the enemy will try very hard to convince us that our excuses are so good that they are in fact legitimate reasons to consider ourselves exception to the rule of Jesus' way of life, that we are excused from obeying and we rule ourselves out. We say silly things like, if I only had more time, or I'll do it later, maybe when the kids are grown. When I retire, I'll start in the fall. I'm too old to start now. The problem is we rule ourselves out of the blessing and freedom and healing that Jesus offers when we believe this and choose a life lived in our own limited strength and capacity while being ruled by things that cannot bless us. That's the tyranny of the urgent. That's the busy life where we feel like we have to do everything, or we have to try to be productive all the time. So 2 things. First, you aren't the exception, you're the rule. Second, often we feel we cannot follow Jesus' way of life because we have this particular idea of what that would entail, and it just seems overwhelming and impossible. And that can be because we're actually taking on burdens we weren't meant to bear while trying to follow Jesus. We might think like, well, I can't possibly pray for like a whole hour every day. It's not practical. Yeah, it might not be. That might not be the form that it needs to take for you. Recently, I realized one of my struggles with prayer was I had that exact expectation. Like, if I didn't take at least an hour a day, it wouldn't be enough. Like, it didn't count. And in that, I felt like I needed to make sure I prayed for everyone and remembered all the prayer requests and covered all the bases. And when I took off that expectation and I just let prayer be as long or as short as I needed it to be that day, and just let the Holy Spirit bring to mind what I ought to pray for, because like he heard me yesterday, I don't need to repeat myself constantly. And I worked from some different methods of prayer for days when I couldn't find words or I struggled to focus. And things went so much better. This is the most consistent my prayer life has ever been by letting it be inconsistent. When we apply Christ's rule of life, it is very okay for it to look different person to person and even in different seasons of our own lives. What is not okay is letting other things get between us and life with God. We're going to talk about this in a future session in much more detail. But all of those reasons, why not? If those aren't idols in our lives right now, they're very much at risk of becoming idols. If they get between us and God, it's not good. They have to be in their proper place. Now, one of my favorite accounts of Jesus' life is when he is visiting Mary and Martha. And Martha is busy doing a million things. She is getting dinner ready and the accommodations for Jesus and his disciples. And Mary is sitting at Jesus' feet. She's listening to him teach. And Martha reaches her limit and she says to Jesus, "Why don't you tell Mary to help me? There's so much to get done. She's just sitting there. Don't you even care?" And in Luke 10, Jesus answers her, "Martha, Martha," the Lord answered, "you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her." That is one of the most freeing things that the Holy Spirit will bring to my mind, that one thing is needed. It is so easy to end up living in the tyranny of the urgent, where we live constantly reacting to whatever is demanding our attention, whatever needs are around us or presented to us, even our internal compulsions, until it is a deeply ingrained way of life and it just feels wrong to say no or wait, or to say wait to those urgent things. It feels wrong even to take time to sit at the feet of Jesus, as though that's only a treat for when the entire to-do list is done. But you know what? That's works righteousness. We have to actually deny that compulsion. That is something that's gone wrong inside of us. And instead, we need to trust that God knows what he's doing, that there will be time for what is needed. He is the Lord of time, after all, that it is safe to follow Jesus. Because the alternative is to stay too busy to follow Jesus and to settle for poor substitutes that are slowly killing us from the inside out. John Mark says that the hard truth is that following Jesus is something you do. It is a practice as much as a faith. At their core, the practices of Jesus are about a relationship with the God he called Father, and all relationships take time. We get out what we put in. This isn't some legalistic guilt trip. This is an invitation to the life we actually ache for, a life that can be found only by moving through the world shoulder to shoulder with Jesus. So by way of practice this week, and as I've said several times, we are going to get into increasingly specific practices in the sessions. But this is a really simple exercise from John Mark Comer, from a podcast of his, actually, that you can start doing right now. And what he suggests is that you simply start observing prayerfully, because we often need the Holy Spirit to show us, but we start observing where we spend our time or our attention or money. You can adjust this to wherever God's nudging you. This is not about judgment. You don't need to start determining if it's good or bad at this stage. All you need to do is take note, especially what habits are in your life, what you tend to go to over and over. Then after a while, and it can be like weeks if that's needed, but don't forget about this. Start the process and stick with it. Then choose one habit, choose one way that you spend your time, and examine what that habit is doing to you. Is it adding to your life? If so, how? Is it costing you? If so, what is it costing? Just a little cost-benefit analysis. And most importantly, what is it doing to you as a human being? What are you becoming because of that habit? Now, if you realize this is actually really good for me and God is pleased with this, lean into it a little more. I realized I struggle a lot less when I have one day a week where I don't have to interact with other human beings. So now I have a practice of silence and solitude one day a week where Bethany has a time out from people, because I am a much better version of myself the other 6 days of the week when I stick with that. Now, if you realize that the habit in question is not doing good things for you, John Mark suggests you consider replacing it, or at least part of the time spent on that habit, with a spiritual practice. He gives an example of how he stopped watching TV in the evening, not because it was bad. He still watches TV at other times, but he started practicing examine prayer in the evening, where he goes through his day with God. He just talks to God about it. Sometimes there's confession, sometimes there's thanksgiving. He prays for people. He processes the day with his Father. And within a few months, he found that he slept better. He has more peace and less anxiety. He has more intimacy with God. It's positively affected his work, his relationships, his entire well-being, just by replacing one thing. Now, none of this is said to shame or guilt anyone at all for any habit or way you spend time. It is an invitation to live deliberately, to follow Jesus, to come away for a while and meet with God in whatever way God is saying you need this. We trust that God knows what he is doing, whether he prompts you to lay something down you think is harmless or even necessary, to say no to someone, to start a new spiritual practice, even if you have no idea how this could possibly work. Trust him. Take him at his word. God isn't out of touch. He knows everything. You don't have to edit his plans for you to make them work. They're gonna work. Be gentle with yourself and start small. Don't overwhelm yourself. You don't need to revise your entire existence today, but follow him faithfully. I am praying for you. I am more than happy to talk with you more about anything touched on in these sessions. If you have questions or comments or concerns, but just know that you are prayed for, and I'm going to continue to encourage you. And I'm very, very, very excited for how God is going to bless you in this.